The ballroom at Lady Weston's house in Grosvenor Square held 200 candles that April evening, and not one of them illuminated the corner where Lord Barnard Hartwell stood with his niece, and spoke about her as though she were a piece of luggage he had carried too long. Eliza stood at her uncle's left shoulder in a gown of pale gray silk that had been her mother's, taken in twice, and retrimmed with Brussels lace that was beginning, at the hem, to fray. She stood with her hands folded at her waist, and her eyes forward, and her breathing measured, the way she had learned to stand in rooms that did not expect her to speak. She could hear him. She was meant to hear him. That, she understood, was part of the arrangement. "Give her to anyone," Lord Barnard said. He said it quietly, as men say things they mean, to Mr. Peel of the Treasury, who had inquired after the young woman at his elbow with the particular attention of a man who had already inquired elsewhere. A reasonable settlement, a clean house, a willing signature. I am not particular about the name. He was not particular about hers either. He had called her Eliza's mother's daughter on 3 separate occasions since taking her under his guardianship 14 months prior, as though the specific syllables of her name required more memory than he wished to expend. Across the room, a man stood alone. He stood apart from the clusters of officers and heirs and dowagers' satellites with the particular stillness of someone who had long ago decided that the room's attention was not worth the price of soliciting it. He was tall and lean and dressed in black, his cravat white and simply knotted, his face the kind of face that candlelight renders interesting rather than warm. He was Julian Cavendish, the Duke of Ashvale. And he was not, as far as Eliza could determine in one careful sideways glance, looking at anything at all. She was wrong about that. She had been in London for 1 season, and she had already learned, at considerable cost, that she was frequently wrong about rooms. Let us return to the beginning, because the beginning matters. It is October of the previous year, and Eliza's father, a clergyman of moderate means and immoderate learning, has died of a fever contracted in his own draughty study, leaving his daughter 312 books, a pianoforte with 2 sticking keys, and precisely no provision against the world. The house in Oxfordshire was a rectory, and therefore not his to leave. The living passed to the new vicar. The books were boxed and sent ahead to Barnard's London townhouse, where they arrived to find Barnard's housekeeper eyeing the available shelf space with visible reluctance. Eliza was 23 years old. Her father had educated her as he had educated himself, without apology or design for the market it might produce. She read Latin and French with equal fluency, and had strong opinions about natural philosophy and the organization of parish records. None of these qualities had a price in any ledger Barnard kept. What Barnard kept, instead, was a debt of £4,000 to a Mr. Silas Webb of Cheapside, contracted 3 years prior in a moment of speculative confidence that the market had not shared. The debt had accumulated quietly, the way such things do, until Webb's solicitor began appearing at Barnard's door with the regularity of a bad season. Eliza was the asset Barnard had not yet liquidated. She understood this. She was not a woman who protected herself with comfortable fictions. She had understood it since the first evening she sat at Barnard's dining table and watched his eyes move from her face to the middle distance. Calculating, she had understood it more precisely the morning he had shown her the debt schedule, as though the numbers were a kind of courtesy, an explanation for what was coming. £4,000, a sum that required a husband with enough income to make it irrelevant, or enough generosity to make it worthwhile. She had not cried. She had looked at the numbers, and she had asked, very quietly, how long she had. "The season," Barnard had said. "1 season. That is what I can afford." So she had come to London in a grey gown that had been her mother's, and she had presented herself at Lady Weston's ball with the composure of a woman who has already assessed the situation and found it manageable, if only barely. She did not expect love. She did not expect warmth. She expected a transaction, and she expected to survive it. And she expected, eventually, to find something inside whatever life it produced that was genuinely and privately hers. That was all she had ever expected. The Duke of Ashvale heard Barnard from 12 feet away. He heard the words, "Give her to anyone," with the particular clarity of a man whose attention has been elsewhere and is suddenly, without his permission, collected and focused on a single point. He had not intended to attend Lady Weston's ball. He had attended because his mother had spent 3 weeks suggesting it, and because he had found, at 34, that resistance to his mother required more energy than occasional compliance. He had positioned himself in the corner with a glass of claret he did not drink, and he had been, to all visible purposes, absent from the room. And then a man's voice had said, "Give her to anyone," and Julian had looked. He had looked at the girl in the grey gown with the fraying hem and the folded hands, and the spine that refused, despite the occasion, to soften. He had looked at the particular quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of a woman who has not heard something, but of a woman who has heard something precisely and has decided, in that fraction of a second, not to let it show. He had looked at her profile, which was not remarkable by the room's current accounting, and then at her hands, which were still, and then at Barnard's profile beside hers, which was satisfied. Something moved in Julian's chest. He did not examine it. He crossed the room. He crossed it without hurrying and without announcing himself, and the crowd parted with the reflex of long practice, because the Duke of Ashvale was the kind of man for whom crowds parted. He stopped at Barnard's shoulder. Barnard turned. His expression arranged itself into the specific configuration of a man who has unexpectedly encountered someone considerably above his weight. "Your Grace," Barnard said. Julian did not look at him. He looked at the woman in the grey gown, and he said her name. He said it quietly and correctly, as though he had known it for some time, as though it were a fact he had already committed to his private record. "Miss Hartwell." It landed the way her name had not landed in 14 months. Not a query, not an obligation. A fact, stated by someone who had located the fact and decided it was worth stating. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were brown, steady, and gave nothing away, and Julian recognized that steadiness immediately as the same discipline he himself deployed in rooms that required it. "Your Grace," she said. He said he believed she was engaged for the second set. She was not. They both knew she was not. The fiction was offered with such level precision that it was not precisely a lie, but rather a proposition, and she recognized, in the 2 seconds she had to decide, that accepting it was the only available path that did not lead directly to Mr. Peel of the Treasury. "I believe I am," she said. Barnard said nothing. He stepped back. Eliza took the Duke's offered arm, and they walked toward the floor. And as they walked, she did not permit herself to look at her uncle's face, because she already knew its expression, and she did not need to confirm it. She needed instead to manage her own breathing, which had become, in the last 60 seconds, a project requiring conscious attention. If you are finding yourself already partial to Eliza's quiet courage, you are in the right company. Stay with us. The evening produced 2 further dances and a conversation of 20 minutes, during which Julian asked her 3 questions about natural philosophy that were not, she noticed, the questions that men usually asked when they wished to be thought interested without committing to actual attention. They were precise questions, the kind that assumed she had read the relevant texts and formed actual opinions. She said so. He listened with the particular quality of listening that involves no commentary offered in advance of the speaker's completion. At the end of the evening, he spoke to Barnard for 4 minutes at the threshold of the withdrawing room. Eliza was not present. She did not know what was said. She knew only that the following Thursday a letter arrived addressed to Lord Hartwell, that Barnard read it twice, that his expression over the breakfast table that morning carried the careful blankness of a man working to conceal his satisfaction, and that within the week she found herself in a carriage bound for Northamptonshire, with a trunk, her father's 312 books, and an invitation to spend the month of June at Ashvale as the Duke's guest. She understood what it meant. She understood it with the precise literacy of a woman who has read the situation's documents carefully. It meant the Duke of Ashvale was considering a marriage that would be, at its foundation, a transaction, and that she was to be assessed on his estate before the transaction was confirmed. She was not insulted by this. She was clear-eyed about it. She had not expected the second dance to be anything other than what it was, a man of rank rescuing her from a cruder transaction, and she was grateful for the rescue without permitting herself to mistake it for something warmer. Ashvale announced itself first as a gatehouse, and then as an avenue of limes, and then as a facade of gray stone that seemed, in the late afternoon light, to be made of the same material as the sky above it. The house was old, in the way that houses are old when they have been continuously inhabited, rather than merely continuously standing, with a warmth in its worn stone that surprised her. Agnes opened the door. Agnes was the senior housemaid, small and upright and plain-spoken, with the manner of a woman who had served the house since before Julian's father was grown and intended to serve it past the current incumbent. She took Eliza's cloak and said, without preamble, that the east wing was warmer, and the Duke had given instructions accordingly, and that supper would be cold if left to itself. The Dowager Duchess of Ashvale was already in the drawing-room. Lady Dorothea Cavendish sat in the large chair nearest the fire with the composed authority of a woman who has never, in her 61 years, sat in any other posture. She was handsome, with the particular handsomeness of women who have decided that age shall not inconvenience them. And her jewels, 3 strands of matched pearls, were exactly the right weight for a country drawing-room in the early evening. She looked at Eliza with an expression that was entirely polite. "Miss Hartwell," she said. "What an interesting arrangement." She said arrangement the way one says a word one expects will settle something. Not unkind, precisely. Precise. Beside the Dowager sat Miss Cecily Vane, who was 20 years old and fair-haired, and dressed in a yellow silk that had been made for her this season and not taken in from anyone else's wardrobe. She was lovely in the way that women are lovely when the world has arranged itself around their loveliness since birth, with an ease of manner that had never been tested by circumstance. She did not look at Eliza with cruelty. She looked at her with a mild, pleasantly confident interest, the way one looks at something that will not long require one's attention. Eliza sat down and accepted a cup of tea and did not allow her face to confirm anything she was thinking. The days at Ashvale established their own rhythm. Julian was present at breakfast, at dinner, occasionally in the library, which was where Eliza spent her mornings. He was not, in those early days, warm. He was precise, attentive in the minimal way of a man who has not decided yet whether attention is warranted, and occasionally there would be a pause in conversation, during which she would feel, without being able to point to any specific cause, that he was watching her. She filed these pauses in a mental register labeled "uncertain" and let them stand. The library had 3,000 volumes and a window facing north. She found his copy of Hutton's Geological Theory on the 3rd morning and was reading it in the window seat, her feet tucked under her and her hair not yet fully dressed, when Julian entered at 7 o'clock and stopped at the door. He did not speak immediately. She looked up. He looked at the book in her hands, and she had the distinct impression that the expression on his face had been, for 1/2 second, something other than composed, and that he had corrected it before she could identify it with any precision. "I would have thought," he said at last, "you were sleeping." "I was not," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair across from the window and opened his own book, and they read in silence for an hour, and it was, she recognized, the most comfortable she had been since October. She filed that in a different register and tried not to look at it. The Dowager's campaign against her was conducted with considerable finesse, which made it, paradoxically, more difficult to resent. There were no crude insults. There were comments delivered in the drawing room in the presence of 3 or 4 people about the practical value of certain qualities in a mistress of a great house. There were comparisons, never direct, between what a woman of Cecily's formation and position might bring to a household of Ashvale's standing, compared to, and here the sentence would trail into a meaningful pause that said everything without saying it. At a morning visit by Lady Weston and her daughter, the Dowager said, in a voice audible to the room, that Eliza was a perfectly sensible arrangement for the short term, and that everyone hoped the summer would prove clarifying. Arrangement. The word again, in a new setting with new witnesses. Eliza poured tea and did not spill any of it. The second voicing came at the Ashvale garden party, held in the second week of June under a sky of improbable blueness. A Mrs. Holt, who wrote regularly to 3 London correspondents and knew it, inquired of the Dowager who the young woman in the gray-green gown was, and the Dowager said, with a gracious little incline of her head, that Miss Hartwell was a temporary arrangement of Lord Ashvale's making, very practical for the present season, and that one hoped the girl would find something suitable before the autumn. Mrs. Holt nodded with the expression of a woman filing the information for distribution at the earliest convenience. Eliza was standing 12 feet away at the rose border, near enough to have heard it, far enough to have required no acknowledgement of having done so. She looked at the roses, which were full and red and frankly beautiful, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and then she went to fetch lemonade for a child who had been left near the fountain and looked overheated. What she did not see was Julian, standing at the terrace door behind her. He had come out to find Finch, his solicitor, who had arrived that afternoon on a matter of some procedural urgency. He had found, instead, a view of his own garden party that he had not anticipated, and he had stood very still at the terrace door, his profile against the stone frame, watching Eliza listen to his mother call her a temporary arrangement, watching her turn to the roses, watching her breathe and decide and then walk across the lawn to bring lemonade to a hot and slightly alarmed child who did not yet know her name. He watched the child's face relax under her attention, the way faces do when someone speaks to them with direct, genuine interest and no performance. He watched her kneel in the grass without reference to her gown, and put herself at the child's eye level, and listen with the same quality of listening she had shown him in the library. He stood at the terrace door for longer than he had intended to stand. There is a particular kind of moment that a careful, wounded man does not announce when it arrives, even to himself. He files it in a register he does not name, and turns back to the house to find Finch. The wound, when it surfaced quietly. It had been 2 years since Charlotte died, and Julian did not speak of her often, because speaking of her had not, in his experience, reduced the specific weight of what he carried. Charlotte had been gentle and earnest, and had tried, in the 2 years of their marriage, to read him. She had not succeeded, because he had not helped her, because he had believed, in the confident way of men who have not yet been stripped of certainty, that his reserve was a kind of protection and not a kind of distance. She had died in childbed in the 2nd year, the child with her, and the house had been too quiet since, and he had not, until recently, known what to do with the quiet. Her portrait hung in the upper gallery, facing the window. He had turned it, 6 months after her death, so that it faced the wall, because he could not walk past it without the specific sensation of having failed something he could not now repair. He kept it turned as a man keeps a locked door, not because he has forgotten what is behind it, but because he has not yet decided what to do about it. Agnes knew this. Agnes knew most things about the house that were worth knowing, and she regarded the turned portrait with the particular attention of a woman who understood what it meant and believed it would eventually need to be addressed. Agnes also knew what she had seen in the East Corridor. She had been there on the afternoon the dowager's maid came to Eliza's door with an envelope and a very soft, very specific request that Miss Hartwell consider whether she might find the remainder of the summer more comfortable elsewhere, and whether £60 might ease the inconvenience of a return to London. £60, offered quietly, as a practical solution to a practical situation. The maid had said the dowager wished only Miss Hartwell's comfort and happiness, and that the sum was meant in the most generous of spirits. Eliza had looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she had said, with extreme courtesy, that she thanked Lady Cavendish for her concern, that £60 was a generous thought, and that she would not be taking it. The maid had gone. Eliza had closed her door. Agnes, who had been at the linen press at the end of the corridor, and whose presence the maid had failed to register, had carried the information with her for the remainder of the day, and that evening had found occasion to place it, without elaboration, before Julian. Julian said nothing in response. He looked at the fire for a long moment. "Thank you, Agnes," he said. Agnes returned to her duties and said nothing further, because she had said everything that needed saying. It was at this point that a letter arrived for Eliza from London, forwarded in Barnard's hand. She recognized the seal before she opened it. A Mr. Silas Webb, through his agents, had called in the full debt of £4,000, accelerated on a technical irregularity in the original note, and required satisfaction before the end of August. Barnard's accompanying note was brief. He was not able, at present, to address the matter from his own resources. He trusted Eliza's summer at Ashvale had proved productive. He had not written the word productive without knowing what it meant. She sat with the letter for a long time. The £60, she observed, would not have touched it. She would leave before she was sold. That was clear to her. She would leave before the situation calcified into something she had not chosen, leave before the financial machinery produced an outcome no one had bothered to ask her about. She had her father's books. She had a tolerable French and a better Latin. She had the name of a school in Bath that had advertised for a language mistress, and the salary was modest, but it was hers. She would write the letter in the morning. That evening at dinner, the dowager presented Cecily at Julian's left hand with the particular deliberateness of a woman placing a final argument on the table. The dinner was the Ashvale Midsummer Gathering, 30 guests at the long table in the oak-paneled dining room, with candles in silver holders and the Cavendish plate laid out the full length of the cloth. It was the kind of dinner that reminded everyone present of the house's weight and reach, and Eliza sat at the lower end of the table between a retired general who was deaf in one ear and a young clergyman who was too nervous to manage his soup without incident. The dowager waited until the second course. Then she said to Mrs. Holt, who was seated within perfect carrying distance, that she had quite made up her mind on the question of the autumn, and that a purely temporary arrangement could not be permitted to become a fixture, however well-intentioned, and that there were young women of genuine qualification who deserved a proper consideration before the season closed. The table held its breath. 28 faces arranged themselves in various configurations of the expression that says, "I am not listening," while listening completely. Cecily looked at her plate. Julian, at the head of the table, was still. Barnard, who had been added to the guest list that afternoon at his own energetic invitation, said loudly from the middle of the table that he was entirely in agreement, that his niece was a practical arrangement of the most temporary sort, and that he had always said so. The candles burned. The retired general's fork scraped his plate. The young clergyman pressed his napkin to his mouth. Eliza looked at her soup. She thought very calmly that she would leave tomorrow rather than this evening, that the letter to Bath could be written tonight and dispatched with the early post, that there was no particular humiliation in this room that she had not already survived in a smaller form, and that she would survive this one with the same apparatus she had used for all the others, which was to keep her spine straight and her face composed and her breathing managed until the room was no longer in a position to observe her. She had decided this. She was holding it as a plan. Julian stood up. He stood up from the head of the table without explanation and without haste, and the room, which had been maintaining its performance of not having heard anything, fell into the specific quiet of people who have suspended all effort and are simply watching. He walked the length of the table. He walked it in 12 strides, measured, with no variation in pace, and the 30 candles and 30 faces tracked him, and the room's held breath did not release. He stopped beside her chair. He said her name, her given name. Not Miss Hartwell, not Lord Hartwell's niece, not the arrangement. He said, "Eliza," and the word fell into the room's held air and did not come back. She looked up at him. His face was composed, as it was always composed, and his eyes were on hers, with a quality of attention she recognized as the same quality he had shown in the library, in the garden. At every moment when he had looked at her, and she had filed it in the register labeled uncertain. She understood, in this moment, that she had mislabeled the register. He said, "I would like to speak to you, if you are willing." It was not a declaration. It was not a speech. It was 4 words of invitation delivered with the level precision of a man who has decided something and is offering the decision for her acceptance, not assuming it. She understood the distinction. She understood, also, that 30 people were watching, and that what she said next would be heard by every one of them. She said, "I am willing." He offered his hand. She took it and stood. At that moment, Mr. Aldous Finch appeared in the doorway, having been brought from his lodging in the village by arrangement. It emerged with Julian's man of business, who had been carrying this specific piece of business for the better part of a week. Finch was a small, efficient man, with the manner of someone accustomed to delivering facts in rooms where facts were not always welcome, and he had in his coat pocket a receipt of settlement from Webb's agent, signed and sealed, for the full £4,000, discharged 3 days prior through a third-party account that required no explanation or acknowledgement from Barnard beyond his own relief. Barnard's face, when Finch announced this to the room with the straightforward clarity of a man with a legal obligation to be clear, cycled through several expressions. He settled, at last, on a careful absence of expression that was the closest he could manage to dignity in the circumstances. "The matter of Lord Hartwell's debt," Finch said, "is entirely resolved." The Dowager sat quite still. Cecily, at Julian's vacated seat, had her eyes on the tablecloth with the particular attention of someone who has understood that the contest she thought she was entered in has been concluded, and concluded elsewhere, and that the result was not the one she had been raised to expect. She did not look cruel. She looked young and slightly lost. And Eliza found, looking at her briefly, that she could not sustain any feeling toward Cecily that was not essentially compassionate. The dowager's eyes came to Eliza and stayed there for a moment. That was long enough to constitute acknowledgement. Something shifted in her face, not softening precisely, more the look of a woman who has been entirely correct about the world for 61 years and has encountered, in this dining room, a single instance in which her correctness has not carried. It was not surrender. It was recognition. She inclined her head, the smallest perceptible degree, and then looked away. In the corridor, the candles in the wall sconces burned lower and made the shadows longer, and Julian kept her hand in his as they walked away from the dining room's noise and toward the library, which was where, she had come to understand, the house was most itself. He told her about Charlotte there, in the library, in the late evening, with the fire low and the north window dark. He told her without excess, in the manner of a man reporting a fact that has cost him considerably, and that he intends to be honest about. He said Charlotte had been good and deserved better than his reserve had given her, and that he had spent 2 years inside that understanding, without knowing what to do with it. Eliza listened, as she always listened, with her whole attention, and no commentary offered before he had finished. When he was done, she said quietly, that she thought grief of that kind was not a moral failure, and that she thought Charlotte, who had been good, would have known that. He looked at her for a long moment. "I thought," he said, "you were leaving tomorrow." "I was," she said. He said he would like it very much if she did not. He said it simply, without ornamentation, and she recognized in the simplicity the same quality that had been present in every short sentence he had offered her since the ball, the sentences she had catalogued and reread and refused to interpret, the sentences that were now, in the library's firelight, perfectly clear. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was too occupied. Besides, with the sensation of the 4,000-pound weight lifting from the part of her chest where it had been residing for the better part of a year. "I was going to write to a school in Bath," she said. "I hope," he said, "that you will write to them anyway. You would be useful to them. I would also hope that the matter might wait." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. Outside the library window, the Northamptonshire night was soft and unstructured, and inside the fire burned down to steady coals, and Agnes, who had been managing the hall candles and was not technically present, permitted herself, before she moved away, a small and private expression of satisfaction. The weeks that followed were a different kind of time. The dowager remained at Ashvale through July, present and composed, with the measured courtesy of a woman who has accepted a changed arrangement without requiring that she enjoy it. She was not cruel to Eliza. She was formal and careful, and she said once, in a private moment in the morning room, that she supposed she had been wrong about certain qualities not being suited to the house, and that she hoped Eliza would not hold the summer's beginning against her. She did not say this easily. Eliza received it with the same gravity it was offered, without triumph, because triumph would have cost her something she preferred to keep. Cecily left Ashvale at the end of the first week of July. Her departure was smooth and well managed, arranged by her own mother with the brisk efficiency of a woman who knows when to regroup. She sent a note to Eliza before she left that was courteous and not quite warm, and contained a line about hoping the house suited her, which Eliza thought was, given the circumstances, more generosity than was strictly required. Barnard did not return to Northamptonshire. He received Finch's accounting, the £4,000 discharged and the accounts settled, with a silence that communicated considerably more than he intended. He wrote to Eliza once, briefly, to say that he hoped the situation would prove mutually satisfactory. She wrote back, with equal brevity, that she was well and that she hoped he was the same. She did not write again. He did not require her to. The banns were read in the Ashvale Parish Church on 3 consecutive Sundays in August and September, and the village received each reading with a satisfaction that was, Agnes said, long overdue. If Eliza's journey through a summer that tried to reduce her to an arrangement has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Your company through a long story means something. The early snow came in November, sooner than anyone had expected, arriving in the night with the quiet efficiency of weather that has not consulted the calendar. Eliza woke to a window made white and lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the room, which was still, after 3 months, a room she had to consciously inhabit rather than simply occupy. The east wing, as Agnes had promised in June, was warmer. She dressed and went down to the drawing room, where the fire had been lit since 6, and the room was warm and gold against the white outside the long windows. She sat at the piano. The keys were all in good repair, unlike her father's instrument, and the tone in the lower register was exceptionally clear, and she played through a short Haydn movement she had memorized at 12 and never forgotten, slowly, because she was not performing for anyone and could take the andante at the pace it wanted. She heard him on the stairs. She kept playing. He came in without announcing himself, which he had ceased to do around the 3rd week of September, and she heard him stop behind the piano bench. She heard him stand there through the end of the movement, and then through a second one, a simpler piece she had composed herself and never named, because it had seemed presumptuous to name something she had made only for herself. She finished and let her hands rest on the keys. "That last one," he said. "Mine," she said. "I wrote it in my father's study when I was 19. He was quiet for a moment. "Play it again." She played it again. When she finished the second time, she looked up, and he was looking at the north wall of the drawing room, where 2 days ago she had noticed the door to the upper gallery had been standing open in the morning and had remained so until evening. She had not asked about it. She had understood, without asking, what it meant. The portrait of Charlotte now faced the window of the upper gallery, as it had been intended to face, toward the light, and Eliza had walked past it once and looked at it long enough to see a young woman who had been good and who had not deserved the distance she had been given. She thought she would be good to the house that Charlotte had loved and had not had long enough to hold. She thought that was the right thing. She was not replacing anything. She was, instead, arriving somewhere that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, to be inhabited by someone who would stay. Julian put his hand on her shoulder. It rested there, warm and particular, through the snowfall that the window showed them in silence. Ashvale held the snow and the fire, and the low sound of the piano's last chord dissolving into the room's warm air, and Eliza sat inside it, her hands quiet at last on the keys. She was home.